This is a buyer contingency to sell form. This form is used when the buyer needs to sell the property they're living in order to complete the transaction and close escrow on the property they're purchasing. So imagine that you are representing the buyer, you're the buyer's agent. You would incorporate this document into your offer, into the purchase agreement. You'd write the address here of the property the buyer is going to buy. You'll click purchase agreement and the date in the top left corner of the purchase agreement so that you're identifying the purchase contract that this is part of. Then you're going to put the address of the home the buyer needs to sell, typically the home the buyer is currently living in. Now, by default, the buyer has 17 days. Or you can check this box and put a number of days for the contingency period. And that's how long the seller is basically stuck. And after that number of days, the seller can then deliver a request to perform and tell the buyer, look, the number of days for the contingency has lapsed. You either need to remove the contingency or I'm going to cancel and move forward with another buyer. The buyer can instead check this box, the or right here, and say the above referenced transaction is contingent on their currently owned property the entire term. So there's not a time period in the beginning. Basically, the entire transaction depends on the buyer selling their home. And then if the buyer's home is already under contract, that info can be filled here. Now, because seller disclosure periods begin upon acceptance of the offer, you can delay that because it's assumed that this transaction may last longer because the buyer may need weeks to find a buyer for their property. And so that's why I could push it back. You can delay when the seller disclosure period lasts or how much time the seller has to deliver disclosures or not. That's addressed here in section 2. And any other terms that come up can be written here in section 3. And then both parties will sign and this form's executed. So this is included in the purchase contract when the buyer is telling the seller that they have to sell their home in order to close on their new home. Now, the other side of this is the seller may need a contingency to find a replacement property. They may need to identify and secure a replacement property before they sell their current property that they're living in. And you'll put the property that is likely where the seller is living now, but it's the property that the buyer is buying, the seller is selling here, the purchase agreement, date of form. And then you're going to see that you have in section 1 17 days in which the seller has as a contingency period to locate that new property. That number can be modified here. Of course, if 17 days pass and there's no update, the buyer can send a request to perform and ask the seller to remove the contingency so the buyer can move forward with the sale, or the buyer can cancel. And same thing as the last form, this contingency could theoretically last the entire term of the transaction, meaning there's no time frame. It's just a contingency that says throughout the entire transaction, if I can't find a replacement property, then I am not selling this property. This transaction is subject to and contingent upon me finding a replacement property. So that's what happens if you check that box here. Now maybe the seller's already under contract for the replacement property. That information can be placed here. There's a delay of buyer contingency periods because remember the buyer has 17 days for appraisal and inspection, 21 days for loan from acceptance. Well, is it fair to the buyer if the seller drags this out for a month or 2 months and the buyer only had 17 days from acceptance? No. So you'll want to delay that. But you don't have to delay it, but there's a way to delay it very easily by checking this box here. And then there's a section 3 for other terms, and anything that the parties can think up and agree to can be written in here, and both parties will sign to execute this document. So just to clarify, the Form 115 is for when a seller needs to secure a replacement property, meaning the seller does not want to complete the sale of their home until they've found a new home to move into. Form 114 is that the buyer must sell the home they're currently living in order to be able to complete the transaction on the new home, the home that they're buying, which is right here. And that's typically when a buyer can't afford to have 2 mortgages or for whatever reason with their loan, their mortgage. They need to sell the home they're currently living in. So that's when you'll have these contingency forms in place. Forms 114 and 115 for the seller.